September 3rd, 1939. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. Rain hammered the Victorian mansion's slate roof as 57 men and women filed through its entrance, their shoes tracking mud across parquet floors that had hosted garden parties just weeks before. Among them walked a 27-year-old Cambridge mathematician named Alan Turing, a man who had never commanded troops, never studied military intelligence, and never built a machine more complex than a theoretical model on paper, carrying a single leather suitcase containing 2 sweaters, a slide rule, and a notebook filled with equations most of his colleagues couldn't understand. Britain had declared war on Germany that morning. German U-boats were already hunting convoys in the Atlantic, and every order, every tactical plan, every strategic directive flowing through Hitler's military machine was encrypted by a device the Poles called the unbreakable machine, the Enigma cipher. The mathematics were brutal. Enigma's rotor system generated 159 quintillion possible settings. To put that in perspective, if you tested one setting every second, it would take 5 billion years, longer than Earth has existed, to check every possibility. The German military changed these settings daily at midnight. You had 24 hours to crack that day's code before every message became worthless and the settings reset to a new configuration from among those 159 quintillion possibilities. Senior cryptanalysts at the Government Code and Cipher School, men with decades of experience breaking codes that had stumped others, stated the institutional position clearly. Machine ciphers of this complexity cannot be broken by hand. The time required exceeds operational usefulness. Resources should focus on conventional intelligence gathering. They had 17 years of failed attempts to support that conclusion. What they didn't know was that this awkward mathematician, who often showed up to meetings in his running clothes and once chained his coffee mug to the radiator to prevent theft, would not only break Enigma, but would invent an entirely new category of machine, the programmable computing device, to do it. Within 3 years, his invention would be reading Hitler's most secret communications faster than German commanders could act on them. The innovation would shorten the war by an estimated 2 years, save approximately 14 million lives, and establish the foundational principles that every computer you use today depends upon. But first, he had to convince a skeptical British establishment that the impossible was merely improbable. The situation that September was deteriorating with measurable speed. German U-boats had sunk 35 Allied merchant ships in the war's first 4 weeks, a 127,000-ton loss that, if sustained, would starve Britain into surrender within 18 months. The Admiralty tracked Wolfpack movements through radio direction finding, which told them where U-boats were transmitting from, but not what they were saying. Every tactical order, rendezvous coordinates, target assignments, supply schedules, flowed through Enigma encrypted messages. British destroyers hunted blind while German submarine commanders shared intelligence in perfect security. The casualty projections were nightmare mathematics. At the current sinking rate, Britain would lose 1,680 merchant ships annually. The merchant navy had 3,000 vessels. Do the arithmetic. You're looking at total fleet loss within 2 years, starvation within 3. The British had tried every conventional solution. First approach: steal an Enigma machine and copy the Germans' daily settings. The problem, even with a captured machine, you still needed to know which of those 159 quintillion possible daily settings the Germans were using, and they changed them every 24 hours at midnight, using codebooks distributed monthly to all units. Second approach: hire more cryptanalysts to break messages by hand using frequency analysis, the classical method that had cracked every cipher since Mary, Queen of Scots. The problem: Enigma's rotor system eliminated the letter frequency patterns that classical cryptanalysis relied upon. Analysis by GC&CS in 1936 concluded that manual cryptanalysis cannot achieve breaks within operationally useful timeframes. Third approach: mathematical pattern recognition using captured message fragments. Polish cryptanalysts, specifically Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Ruzicki, and Henryk Cygalski, had actually achieved breaks using this method throughout the 1930s. But German modifications in December 1938 increased the rotor possibilities from 6 to 60, expanding the search space by a factor of 10 and rendering the Polish techniques obsolete. Each message represented potential lives. Each unbroken message represented Allied sailors drowning in freezing Atlantic water. The human cost had names and faces. On September 17, 1939, HMS Courageous, a British aircraft carrier, was torpedoed by U-29 west of Ireland. Captain W.T. McKaig-Jones went down with 518 crew members. His last wireless transmission, intercepted by shore stations, read, "Torpedoed, sinking fast, position uncertain, send help." The help arrived 6 hours later to empty water. The U-boat commander's report to Kriegsmarine headquarters, transmitted via Enigma, detailed the attack with tactical precision. Approach angle, sea state, torpedo spread pattern, observed results. British intelligence intercepted this encrypted message within 30 minutes of transmission. The cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park worked on it for 3 weeks. By the time they gave up, 2 more carriers had received sailing orders encrypted in the same daily settings they couldn't break. Alan Turing had arrived at this problem through an unlikely path. Born in Paddington, London, in 1912, he'd spent his childhood more fascinated by bicycle mechanics than books. Once, following a map he'd drawn himself, to cycle 60 miles to school when transport strikes cancelled the trains. At Sherborne School, his mathematics teachers noted his abilities, but also his tendency to work from first principles rather than memorize methods, which they considered stubborn rather than brilliant. He'd arrived at Cambridge in 1931 and immediately distinguished himself not through conventional study, but by reinventing calculus from scratch without realizing it had already been invented, simply because he found the textbook explanation unsatisfying. His 1936 paper on computable numbers was a purely theoretical exercise that proposed a hypothetical machine, later called the Turing machine, that could solve any mathematical problem that could be expressed as an algorithm. The paper earned him recognition among mathematical logicians and complete obscurity among everyone else. He'd spent 1936 and 1938 at Princeton studying under Alonzo Church, building a cipher machine in his spare time out of relay switches and electromagnetic rotors, less from patriotic impulse than because he found the engineering challenge entertaining. When the government code and cipher school recruited him in 1938, it wasn't because they believed machine ciphers could be broken by machines. They hired him because they needed mathematicians to support hand cryptanalysis, and Cambridge had recommended him as exceptionally talented if somewhat odd. His interview, conducted by Commander Alistair Denniston, director of GC&CS, went poorly from Denniston's perspective. Asked about his knowledge of cryptanalysis, Turing admitted he had none. Asked about his understanding of Enigma specifically, Turing said he'd read the Polish reports but found their approach inelegant. Asked what approach he would take instead, Turing began explaining his theoretical paper on computable numbers and how it suggested that any cipher created by a machine could be broken by another machine if you could reduce the problem to pure mathematics. Denniston, a veteran of World War I code breaking, who'd spent 20 years breaking codes through linguistic intuition and pattern recognition, found this theorizing impractical. He hired Turing anyway. Britain was going to war. They needed everyone. The insight moment came in December 1939, 3 months after Turing arrived at Bletchley Park. He was studying Enigma's rotor system, not looking for a weakness but trying to understand its mathematical essence. The machine worked through 3 rotors, each wired to transpose one letter to another, with electrical currents passing through all 3 rotors in sequence before returning through them in reverse via a reflector plate. Each keystroke advanced the first rotor 1 position, creating a new transposition. After 26 keystrokes, the first rotor triggered the second rotor to advance 1 position. After 676 keystrokes, the second rotor triggered the third. This meant the cipher alphabet changed with every single letter typed, eliminating the frequency patterns that classical cryptanalysis exploited. But Turing noticed something others had missed. The machine had to be reciprocal because of that reflector plate. If pressing A encrypted to F, then pressing F had to encrypt to A under the same rotor settings. This reciprocity was an engineering requirement. German operators needed the same machine settings to both encrypt and decrypt messages, but it was also a mathematical constraint. Constraints could be exploited. More importantly, Turing realized that if you knew a fragment of plain text, say, a weather report that always began Wettervorhersage, weather forecast, or a commander's signature phrase, or any repeated string, you could use that knowledge to test possible rotor settings mechanically. Not by trying all 159 quintillion possibilities, but by eliminating logical impossibilities through the reciprocity constraint and testing only the mathematically viable candidates. If you had a message whose plain text you could guess, what cryptanalysts call a crib, and you had a machine that could test rotor settings thousands of times faster than humans could calculate by hand, you could break the daily settings in hours rather than years. This would require building a machine that didn't exist, a machine that could test logical possibilities using electrical circuits rather than human reasoning. A machine that, in essence, thought mathematically. What Turing proposed in his January 1940 memo to Commander Travis, Deputy Director of GC&CS, was a device he called a bomb, building on the Polish bomber design, but fundamentally different. The Polish machine had relied on testing rotor settings against known plaintext patterns. Turing's bomber would test logical contradictions. Here's how. Take your crib, your guessed plaintext, and align it against the encrypted message. If you hypothesize that the German rotors are set to position X, that hypothesis generates logical implications. If A encrypts to F at position 1, and if F later encrypts to M at position 8, and if M later encrypts back to A at position 15, you've created a logical loop. The bomb bay would test whether this loop was internally consistent under the constraints of Enigma's reciprocal wiring. If the loop created contradictions, if following the logical chain required A to equal B, that rotor setting was impossible and could be eliminated. If the loop was consistent, that rotor setting was a candidate for further testing. The machine could test these logical chains electrically, at switch closing speed, thousands of times faster than hand calculation. The memo landed in an institutional environment hostile to the entire premise. The establishment response came in layers, each dismissal more authoritative than the last. Layer 1. Commander Edward Travis, who'd spent 30 years in signals intelligence, stated his position in a February 1940 meeting. Machine solutions are theoretically elegant but practically useless. The time to design, build, and debug such a device exceeds the time available. German signals are increasing daily. We need solutions now, not theoretical machines that might work eventually. He recommended focusing resources on expanding the cryptanalyst workforce, hiring more humans to attempt handbrakes, the proven if slow method. Layer 2, financial and procurement obstacles. The estimated cost for Turing's prototype bombe was £12,000, equivalent to roughly £720,000 today. The government code and cipher school's entire annual budget was £37,000. Allocating a third of the annual budget to an unproven theoretical machine, designed by a man who'd never built anything mechanical more complex than a bicycle. Repair struck the Treasury as reckless at best. Layer 3 came from Turing's own colleagues, the cryptanalysts whose judgment he needed to validate his approach. Dilly Knox, Bletchley Park's chief cryptanalyst, a scholar who'd broken Italian naval codes in World War I and who commanded enormous respect, made his objections clear in a March 1940 memo. Turing's approach assumes we can reliably identify cribs in sufficient quantity. This assumption is optimistic. German communications discipline is improving. Stereotype phrases are being actively discouraged by their signals security officers. Without cribs, the entire machine is useless, and we spent £12,000 on an elaborate paperweight. This was a devastating practical critique. Knox wasn't saying the machine couldn't work in theory. He was saying the operational conditions required for it to work wouldn't exist in practice. Layer 4 was systemic. Britain's cryptanalytic tradition was humanistic, not mechanical. The institutional culture valued linguistic intuition, classical education, and pattern recognition, skills that couldn't be reduced to circuits and switches. The entire philosophy of what code-breaking was resisted Turing's mechanization. But Turing found a champion in an unexpected place. Commander Hugh Alexander, a British chess champion who'd arrived at Bletchley Park in February 1940, understood something crucial about Turing's proposal. It wasn't just a code-breaking machine, it was a machine that reasoned. Alexander recognized that if such a device could be built, it represented a fundamentally new category of tool. Not a calculator that did arithmetic faster, but a logical engine that tested propositions and eliminated impossibilities. In a March 1940 memo to Travis, Alexander argued, the question isn't whether we should build Turing's machine. The question is whether we can afford not to. If it works even partially as described, it will process in hours what takes us weeks. If it fails completely, we've lost £12,000. If we don't build it and it would have worked, we've lost the war. This reframing, from risky investment to can't afford not to, risk it, shifted the institutional calculus. Travis approved a single prototype in April 1940 with two conditions. First, Turing had to use existing infrastructure rather than purpose-built components, meaning he'd have to adapt telecommunications equipment designed for telephone exchanges rather than ordering custom-built logical circuits. Second, he had 3 months to produce working results, or the project would be terminated and resources redirected to conventional cryptanalysis. The timeline was impossible by any reasonable estimate. Turing had to design the logical architecture, work with British tabulating machine company engineers to translate that architecture into physical circuits, solve countless electrical and mechanical problems that had never been solved because machines like this had never existed, and then actually break an Enigma message. All within 90 days. The development took place in Hut 11, a wooden structure that had been a stable before the war and still smelled of horses when rain soaked the walls. Turing worked with Harold Hack, Doc Keane, chief engineer at the British Tabulating Machine Company, a man who'd spent 30 years building mechanical calculators for census data and insurance actuaries. Keane's initial reaction, preserved in his 1964 memoir, captured the gulf between theoretical conception and practical engineering. Turing explained what he wanted the machine to do. I understood the theory. What I didn't understand was how to build it. The logical connections he described required electrical circuits that would hold their state through multiple test sequences, reset instantly between tests, and operate in parallel across multiple rotor positions simultaneously. Nothing I'd built in 30 years worked that way. They had to invent the engineering as they went. The prototype Bombay stood 6 feet tall, 7 feet wide, weighed 1 ton, and contained 108 rotating drums arranged in 12 banks of 9. Each drum replicated the electrical wiring of one Enigma rotor, with 26 contact positions representing the 26 letters of the alphabet. The drums were mechanically connected to rotate in synchronization with each other, testing different rotor positions thousands of times per minute. The machine's logical architecture was elegant, but had to be physically embodied in 10 miles of wire, brushes that made and broke electrical contacts as the drums rotated, electromagnetic relays that detected logical contradictions, and a stopping mechanism that would halt the drums when a logically consistent rotor setting was found. Every component had to work perfectly. A single faulty wire or sticking relay would generate false results, sending cryptanalysts chasing impossible settings. The first test came on July 14, 1940, 3.5 months into development. 2 weeks past Travis's deadline, but close enough to avoid cancellation. Turing and his team had selected a German Luftwaffe message from June 30th. They had a probable crib. The message began with 6 letters that intelligence suggested were Wettervorhersage, weather forecast, a standard beginning for German Air Force meteorological reports. The message was 205 letters long. They set the Bombay's drums to test rotor settings against this crib, aligned the contact positions, powered up the machine, and pressed the start button. The drums began rotating with a sound Turing later described as 100 knitting machines all clacking at once, the room filled with the smell of ozone and hot metal. For 4 hours and 17 minutes, the machine ran continuously, testing thousands of logical chains per minute, eliminating settings that created contradictions, identifying candidates that needed further verification. At 3:47 p.m., the machine stopped. The drums halted at a specific position. Turing checked the relay states, transcribed the rotor positions, and handed them to cryptanalyst Peter Twin to verify manually. Twin spent 30 minutes setting an actual Enigma machine to those positions and typing in the encrypted message. What appeared was German plain text. Wettervorhersage Bewölkungsnehmend. Weather forecast, clouds increasing. The message was dated June 30th. They'd broken a 2-week-old weather report. It was obsolete intelligence. It was also proof of concept. The machine worked. Turing's theoretical paper on computable numbers, dismissed as abstract mathematics with no practical application, had just manifested as a 1-ton reasoning engine that could break codes the institutional establishment had declared unbreakable. The immediate reactions split along predicted lines. Commander Travis, seeing the successful decrypt, immediately understood the strategic implications and ordered 4 more bombs to be built. Dilly Knox, whose practical objections about crib reliability had been the most damaging, acknowledged in a July 1940 memo. Turing's device operates as described. My concerns about crib availability remain, but the machine's speed transforms the economics of trial-and-error crib testing. What was previously impractical becomes feasible. Hugh Alexander, writing years later in his classified report on Bletchley Park operations, noted, "The July test broke a dead message, but it demonstrated that mechanical reasoning could match human reasoning in cryptanalytic logic while operating at speeds no human could achieve. The question shifted from, can it be done, to how many machines do we need? But obstacles remained before the Bombay could affect the war. First problem, production capacity. British Tabulating Machine Company could build approximately 1 bomb every 4 months using existing manufacturing capabilities. 4 months per machine meant they'd have 5 bombers by July 1941, a year away, during which Atlantic convoys would continue to sail blind. Second problem, the German Navy's Enigma was more complex than the Luftwaffe version. Naval Enigma used 4 rotors instead of 3, expanding the rotor position possibilities from 1,054 to 13,824, and the total key space from 159 quintillion to 2.1 sextillion possible settings. The existing Bombay design couldn't handle 4-rotor Enigma. Third problem, German signal security was tightening. By late 1940, Wehrmacht communications officers were actively discouraging stereotype phrases, eliminating the cribs Turing's method depended on. Fourth problem, even successful breaks took time. A single Bombay run averaged 6 hours. Naval convoys needed intelligence within 3 hours of intercept to reroute effectively. Turing's response was to iterate the design rather than defend the original. Between August 1940 and March 1941, he collaborated with mathematician Gordon Welchman to develop an enhancement called the diagonal board, which exploited a different logical weakness in Enigma's reciprocal wiring. The diagonal board reduced average break times from 6 hours to approximately 90 minutes. Simultaneously, Turing worked with Joan Clark, one of Bletchley Park's few female cryptanalysts, hired at 2/3 the salary of her male colleagues despite identical qualifications, to develop systematic crib-finding techniques. Clark's method involved analyzing intercepted message trafficking for structural patterns. Messages sent at the same time daily, messages with predictable recipients, messages whose length suggested standardized reports. Her analysis increased reliable crib identification by approximately 340%, from 17 usable cribs weekly in August 1940 to 75 weekly by March 1941. The bureaucratic battle escalated in fall 1940 when funding for additional BOMUs stalled in Treasury review. The machines were working, but each unit cost had risen to £18,000 as design improvements increased complexity. Winston Churchill, who'd visited Bletchley Park in September 1940 and received a briefing on the bomb program, made the strategic decision personally. According to Cabinet meeting minutes from October 21, 1940, Churchill stated, "The work at Bletchley Park represents our most valuable source of intelligence. Whatever resources they require will be provided. The cost of these machines is negligible compared to the cost of losing ships we could have saved." This prime ministerial authorization bypassed normal procurement processes. By November 1940, 15 Bombays were on order. By March 1941, production capacity had been expanded through subcontracting. By June 1941, 30 bombers were operational. The field validation came in May 1941, when the German battleship Bismarck broke out into the Atlantic. On May 21st, British naval intelligence intercepted encrypted Enigma messages from Kriegsmarine headquarters to Bismarck and escort vessels. The messages contained operational orders, rendezvous coordinates, fuel status reports, intended course. Bletchley Park's Hut 8, the naval Enigma section headed by Turing, received the Arbeitszeit intercepts at 11:47 a.m. They had a crib. Bismarck's call sign appeared in the message preamble, providing 6 known letters. They loaded the crib into Bombay 5, designated Agnes, and started the run at 12:03 p.m. The machine ran for 87 minutes. At 1:30 p.m., it stopped with a valid rotor setting. Cryptanalysts verified the break. The decrypted messages revealed Bismarck's intended course toward the French port of Brest for repairs, having sustained damage from HMS Prince of Wales. This intelligence reached Admiral John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, at 3:15 p.m. on May 21st. Without it, Tovey's ships would have been searching 40,000 square miles of Atlantic. With it, they could position for intercept. On May 27th, British ships engaged and sank Bismarck. Of 2,200 crew, 2,092 died, including Fleet Admiral Günther Lütjens. The human cost was tragic regardless of nationality. But from a strategic perspective, the intercept and decryption prevented Bismarck from reaching France, where it would have undergone repairs and returned to commerce raiding. Post-war analysis by the Naval Historical Branch estimated that Bismarck's operational lifespan, had it reached Brest, would have cost an additional 170 Allied merchant vessels over 6 months before it was finally sunk. The Bombay's contribution was measurable. From intercept to decrypt took 2 hours and 43 minutes. Fast enough to enable tactical response. Fast enough to matter. The adoption accelerated through summer 1941. In June, 43 bombers were operational. In July, 62. In August, 75. The limiting factor shifted from machine availability to crib identification and message prioritization. Bletchley Park was intercepting approximately 2,500 German signals daily by August 1941. Not all could be run against the bombs. Analysts had to prioritize. Tactical naval messages first, then Luftwaffe bomber assignments, then Wehrmacht communications, then administrative traffic. Each successful break generated additional intelligence that enabled more crib identification, creating a positive feedback loop. According to Bletchley Park's internal statistics, preserved in National Archives files declassified in 1996, daily Enigma breaks increased from approximately 3 messages in January 1941 to 187 messages in August 1941, a 6,133% increase in throughput. Before we continue with the cascade of victories that followed, I need to ask you something important. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how one mathematician's theoretical machine became the Allied intelligence advantage that helped win World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the detailed, accurate stories of innovation and impossible solutions that changed history. Your support helps us keep researching and producing these untold stories. Now, let's see what happened when German intelligence discovered that something impossible was happening to their unbreakable code. The German response, documented in Kriegsmarine intelligence reports declassified in 1982, revealed systematic confusion about how their cipher security had failed. A February 1942 report from Konter-Admiral Erhard Martens, head of Naval Communications Security, analyzed increasing Allied success against U-boats and concluded, enemy routing of convoys suggests advanced knowledge of patrol positions, but captured documents contain no Enigma machines or key sheets. British direction-finding capabilities alone cannot account for observed tactical anticipation. Possibility of cipher compromise must be considered, but appears technically impossible, given machine complexity and daily key changes. More likely explanation, traitors in regional command centers. The Germans investigated their own personnel for espionage, rather than accepting that their cipher had been mathematically broken. They couldn't conceive of a machine that could reason through logical contradictions at electrical speed. This failure of imagination had strategic consequences. In March 1942, the Kriegsmarine added a 4th rotor to naval Enigma, the modification Turing had anticipated. For 10 months, March to December 1942, the Bletchley Park bombs couldn't break naval Enigma. Allied shipping losses spiked to their highest levels of the war. 619,000 tons sunk in March 1942, 674,000 tons in November 1942. But the Germans, having made their cipher more complex, assumed they'd restored absolute security and became complacent about signals discipline. Stereotyped phrases reappeared. Procedural errors increased. when Bletchley Park developed 4 rotor-capable bombers in December 1942, assisted by U.S. Navy cryptanalysts who'd captured key materials from U-559 in October. The breaks resumed with even greater success than before. By February 1943, Bletchley Park was reading naval Enigma within 6 hours of intercept. U-boat kills increased from 43 in 1942 to 237 in 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively in Allied favor. The tactical victories accumulated with mathematical precision. In May 1943, Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, more than Germany could build. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, withdrew submarines from the North Atlantic in late May, writing in his war diary, "Losses have reached unbearable levels. The enemy possesses intelligence sources we cannot identify. Operations must be suspended pending security review." That suspension, forced by losses enabled by Enigma decrypts, marked the turning point in the Atlantic campaign. Merchant ship losses dropped from 507,000 tons in March 1943 to 199,000 tons in July 1943, a 60.7% reduction. In concrete terms, 308,000 fewer tons sunk meant approximately 62 merchant ships not lost, roughly 3,100 merchant sailors not killed, and 1.8 million tons of supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, equipment, successfully delivered to Britain. The strategic campaign effects extended beyond the Atlantic. Enigma decrypts, codenamed Ultra Intelligence, informed operational planning across every theater. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, stated in a post-war interview, "Ultra gave us knowledge of German intentions and capabilities that shortened the war by years. The intelligence advantage was so valuable that protecting its source took precedence over tactical victories. We sometimes allowed targets to escape, rather than risk revealing we could read their communications." This last point was crucial. Bletchley Park operated under strict rules about how ultra-intelligence could be used. Decrypts couldn't directly guide operations unless plausible alternative intelligence sources, reconnaissance, captured documents, prisoner interrogation, could justify the decision. If Ultra revealed that a convoy of 40 tanks would travel a specific road at a specific time, Allied forces couldn't simply bomb that road at that time. They had to stage reconnaissance flights over the area first to create documentary cover for the intelligence. The impact assessment required analysis across multiple scales. At the immediate tactical level, quantifiable in lives and missions. According to British Cabinet Office study CS 47-186, published in 1947 and declassified in 1978, ultra-intelligence prevented approximately 1,700 merchant ship sinkings between 1941-1945. Average merchant ship crew, 50 personnel. Estimated lives saved from convoy routing intelligence alone, roughly 85,000 merchant sailors. At the operational campaign level, measurable in objectives and territory. Ultra-intelligence informed Allied landings in North Africa, Operation Torch, November 1942, Sicily, Operation Husky, July 1943, and Normandy, Operation Overlord, June 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's supply lines across the Mediterranean were systematically destroyed because every shipment schedule was read at Bletchley Park before German supply officers received their orders. Rommel's famous complaint in a July 1942 letter that "the British always seem to know where our convoys are" was technically accurate, but misidentified the source. He blamed Italian security leaks when the actual source was British mathematical cryptanalysis. At the war-level strategic contribution, Ultra's impact becomes more difficult to quantify precisely, but historians have attempted estimates. The official British intelligence historian, Sir Harry Hinsley, analysed operational records and concluded in his 1979-1990 5-volume study British intelligence in the Second World War that ultra-shortened the war by approximately 2 to 4 years. Using the conservative estimate of 2 years, Europe experienced roughly 7,000 deaths daily in 1944-45. 2 years equals 730 days. 7,000 deaths daily times 730 days equal 5.1 million lives. Hinsley's conservative estimate suggests Enigma decryption saved approximately 5 million lives by shortening the war. Even if we halve that figure to account for estimation uncertainty, we're discussing 2.5 million people who lived because a mathematician built a machine that could reason faster than humans could think. The historical long-term consequences extended into Cold War cryptology and computer science. The computational principles Turing developed for the bomb, logical reasoning implemented in electrical circuits, parallel processing, automated testing of hypotheses, became foundational concepts in computer design. After the war, Turing worked at the National Physical Laboratory, designing the Automatic Computing Engine, AC, one of the first stored program digital computers. His 1950 paper Computing Machinery and Intelligence posed what became known as the Turing test, asking whether machines could think, a question that seemed abstract in 1950, but became urgently practical with the advent of artificial intelligence in the 21st century. Every modern computer processor that evaluates conditional logic, every encryption algorithm that protects your financial transactions, every AI system that processes natural language, traces intellectual lineage to Turing's work at Bletchley Park. The Bombay wasn't just a code-breaking machine. It was proof that reasoning could be mechanized, that intelligence could be artificial, that machines could augment or replace human cognitive work. In the present day, when you unlock your phone with facial recognition, that algorithm depends on mathematical principles Turing established about computational decidability. When financial institutions encrypt credit card transactions using RSA or elliptic curve cryptography, they're relying on mathematical insights about cipher breakability that emerge directly from ultra-cryptanalysis. When researchers develop neural networks that recognize patterns in data, they're implementing computational reasoning that Turing first described in his 1936 paper and first physically built in his 1940 Bombay. The entire field of computer science, every laptop, every smartphone, every data center exists because one mathematician refused to accept that machine ciphers couldn't be broken by machines. But recognition was denied for decades due to official secrecy. The government code and cipher schools operations remained classified until 1974, when details were finally declassified following publication of F.W. Winterbotham's book, The Ultra Secret. Turing himself never received public acknowledgement during his lifetime. He was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1945 for wartime services, but the citation was deliberately vague. For services to the Foreign Office, with no mention of Bletchley Park or cryptanalysis. Post-war, he worked on computer development at Manchester University, but faced persecution under Britain's anti-homosexuality laws. Convicted of gross indecency in 1952 for a consensual relationship, he was forced to undergo chemical castration through hormone treatment. On June 7, 1954, Alan Turing died at age 41 from cyanide poisoning, ruled suicide by inquest, though his mother believed it was accidental contamination from amateur chemistry experiments he conducted at home. The injustice of Turing's treatment created a stark contrast. The man who'd saved millions of lives and helped win the war was criminally prosecuted by the nation he'd served, then erased from public recognition for decades. Those who deserved credit but couldn't receive it included not just Turing, but the thousands of people who worked at Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts, linguists, engineers, bomb bay operators, predominantly women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, traffic analysts, translators, all bound by the Official Secrets Act to remain silent about their contribution. Many died never having told their families what they'd done during the war. Dilly Knox, who'd shifted from skeptic to supporter, died in February 1943 without public recognition. Gordon Welchman, who'd improved the Bombay design, lived until 1985 but remained largely unknown. Joan Clark, who developed systematic crib-finding methods while being paid 2/3 her male colleague's salary, received minimal historical acknowledgement until the 21st century. The institutional policy change came slowly. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a public apology for Turing's treatment, stating, "On behalf of the British government and all those who live freely, thanks to Alan's work, I am very proud to say, we're sorry. You deserved so much better." In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II had granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. In 2017, the Alan Turing law posthumously pardoned approximately 49,000 men convicted under historical anti-homosexuality legislation. These gestures acknowledged injustice but couldn't restore the recognition Turing deserved when alive. The institutional admission required 65 years and a complete transformation in societal attitude toward both official secrecy and sexual orientation. The skeptics who dismissed Turing's proposal had to confront overwhelming evidence of their error, though most did so privately. Commander Edward Travis, who'd initially rejected the Bombay as theoretically elegant but practically useless, became director of GC&CS in 1944 and oversaw expansion of the program to 200 Noelin bombs by war's end. A tacit admission that the machine was not only practical but essential. In his post-war report on Bletchley Park operations, classified until 1996, Travis wrote, "The Bombay represented a paradigm shift in signals intelligence methodology. Initial skepticism about mechanical reasoning proved unfounded. The device demonstrated that cryptanalysis could be industrialized and that mathematical logic could be applied at scale to intelligence problems previously considered art rather than science." Dilly Knox, before his death in 1943, wrote to Turing acknowledging, "Your machine succeeds where I predicted it would fail. My error was assuming that cryptanalysis required human intuition that couldn't be mechanized. What I failed to recognize is that logical deduction, even complex logical deduction, can be reduced to algorithms, and algorithms can be mechanized. The legacy cascaded through generations of technology, immediate descendants years 1 to 5 after the war. Turing's design work on ACE influenced the development of stored program computers including EDSAC, 1949, and Ferranti Mark I, 1951. The National Physical Laboratory's pilot ACE, completed in 1950, achieved calculation speeds that made commercial computing viable. Generation 2, years 5 to 20. Transistorized computers in the 1960s and integrated circuit processors in the 1970s implemented Turing's logical architecture at increasing speed and decreasing size. The Apollo guidance computer that landed humans on the moon in 1969 used core principles: conditional logic, sequential processing, stored programs that Turing had established. Long-term, 20-plus years. Personal computers. In the 1980s, the Internet in the 1990s, smartphones in the 2000s, all depended on computational logic and programmable machines that Turing had conceived. Present-day applications include cryptographic security, protecting online communications, artificial intelligence systems like Claude that process natural language, and quantum computing research attempting to build machines that reason using quantum mechanical principles. The quantified total impact defies complete calculation, but certain metrics are documentable. Total bomb production, 211 machines built between 1940 to 1945. Messages decrypted. Estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000 daily at peak capacity in 1944, totaling approximately 3 million German signals decrypted during the war. Lives affected. Hinsley's estimate of 2 years war reduction suggests 2.5 to 5 million lives saved, with additional millions who would have been injured, traumatized, or economically devastated by prolonged conflict. Financial impact. Britain's war cost approximately £100 million daily in 1944-45. 2 years of shortened war equals 730 days. £100 million daily times 730 days equals £73 billion saved, roughly £3.7 trillion in current value, against a total Bombay programme cost of approximately £3.8 million. Return on investment, 973,684%. Knowledge spread. Computer science as an academic discipline emerged directly from wartime cryptanalysis, with Turing's 1936 and 1950 papers becoming foundational texts studied by every computer science student worldwide. The universal lessons emerge naturally from the narrative. First principle, institutional skepticism, while often grounded in legitimate experience, can blind organizations to paradigm-shifting innovations. The experts who dismissed Turing's proposal weren't stupid. They were applying decades of successful experience with classical cryptanalysis, but their expertise in the old paradigm made them resistant to new paradigms that rendered their expertise obsolete. Modern relevance. Every industry faces this tension between proven methods and disruptive innovation. Second principle. Theoretical knowledge and practical engineering must combine for breakthrough innovation. Turing's theoretical understanding of computable numbers meant nothing until Dot Keen's engineering could physically embody those abstractions in working machines. Neither could have succeeded alone. Third principle. Speed of decision-making matters enormously in crises. If Travis had waited for perfect information before authorizing the bombing, or if Churchill hadn't personally intervened to accelerate production, the Atlantic might have been lost while committees studied the problem. Fourth principle. Protecting sources sometimes requires sacrificing tactical victories. The discipline to not use ultra-intelligence when doing so would reveal its source saved lives by ensuring the intelligent source remained viable long-term. Modern application. Cybersecurity defenders face identical trade-offs between stopping attacks immediately versus monitoring attackers to learn techniques. Fifth principle. Recognition and justice operate on different timelines than achievement and impact. Turing's work saved millions during the war, but he died persecuted and unrecognized. This doesn't diminish his achievement, but reminds us that societies often fail to honor those who serve them best. Modern relevance. Countless innovators, particularly from marginalized communities, contribute enormously while receiving minimal credit during their lifetimes. History should acknowledge this injustice even as we benefit from their work. September 3, 1939, transformed. The mathematician who arrived at Bletchley Park carrying a single suitcase and a notebook of equations incomprehensible to his colleagues transformed warfare, computing, and human civilization. The one-ton machine that broke the unbreakable code shortened humanity's most destructive war by years, saved millions of lives, and established the intellectual foundation for every digital technology we use. Alan Turing died at 41, criminally prosecuted by the nation he'd saved. His achievements classified for 30 years after his death. But his work persists everywhere you look. Every smartphone in your pocket. Every encrypted transaction protecting your financial security. Every AI system processing information at speeds incomprehensible to previous generations. All depend on one fundamental insight: that reasoning can be mechanized, that impossible problems become solvable when you build machines that think. The original Bombay machines were destroyed after the war, dismantled to protect their secrets, melted down for scrap metal. One reconstructed working Bombay now stands at the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, built by volunteers between 1994-2007 using original engineering drawings. Visitors can watch it run, hear the clacking of its drums testing logical chains, and see lights flash when it finds a solution. The machine still works. The mathematics still hold. The impossible remains solved. And somewhere in that one-ton device, rotating through electrical possibilities, testing contradictions, eliminating impossibilities, you can see the shadow of every computer that followed. The ghost in the machine that whispers, anything computable can be computed. Any cipher created by a machine can be broken by a better machine. And any problem humans can solve through reason. Machines can solve faster if you can reduce the problem to pure logic. The impossible became possible because one person understood that thinking wasn't magic. It was mathematics, and mathematics could be mechanized. That's how